Hi and welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Rick, and in this video I'm going to talk about the 15 camera settings for real estate photography that I use. This is take 3, hopefully this one will go better. Okay, so the 15 camera settings that I use on my Canon 6D are these. Number 1, AV mode, that's aperture value mode. I select the aperture, I select the ISO, the camera selects the shutter speed. Okay, now why do I use AV mode? Because the aperture is the most important thing to me. I use a Canon 17 to 40mm lens. I don't shoot wide open at f4. I don't shoot stop down to f22. That's maximum and minimum apertures. f4 is the largest hole, f22 the smallest hole. I go somewhere in the middle, and I've settled on f8 because that gives me the sharpest picture that I can get. It also gives me enough depth of field because I'm using a Canon 17 to 40mm lens. Now 17mm is pretty wide, so I don't need massive depth of field because I can get the depth of field I need using f8, and I also get the best quality. If you use the lens wide open or fully stopped down, you start getting errors and fringing and all sorts of other stuff, so I don't advise it. Okay, so number 2 is the aperture f8. The one exception, if there's something in the foreground or right in front of the camera even, and I want that in focus and everything else, then I will go to f16. Okay, number 3, ISO 100. ISO is the sensitivity of the camera sensor to light. ISO 100 is the lowest natural ISO on the Canon 6D. Now, the higher the ISO you use, the higher the chance of getting noise and other digital errors and snowstorms and fluff and stuff. I've played around with 3200 and 6400. But for 95% of my photos I've used 100, and for the rest I probably use 200, 400 or 800, and every now and then when I'm in a dire straits 1600. So the lower the ISO, the higher the quality is the general rule. Okay, number 4, shutter speed. While I'm photographing buildings, they're not moving thankfully or breathing or anything, they're just sat there. So I don't care about the shutter speed because my camera's on a tripod. So I let the camera choose the shutter speed, and that's why I use AV mode really. It doesn't really matter to me. Remote release, number 5. Now, I've had a load of remote releases over the years. I've bought, well, I haven't sold them, I just binned them because some were rubbish, some are broke. I got a better, shinier one. But these days, I don't even use a remote release. And the only time I will, excuse me, is if I got my camera on a pole or out of a window or something, and then I'll use my phone as a remote release. I use this high-tech solution called the self-timer in your camera. I set it to 10 seconds with my camera on the tripod, press the shutter release button, 10 seconds later it takes a photo. Why do I do that? The camera is rock solid, no movement. I want my photos as sharp as I can do every time. Number 6, back button focus. Now this is a custom, easy for me to say, this is a custom function setting on the Canon 6D. And what it does is, when you press the shutter release down, ordinarily, with the way cameras are set up, it focuses and it takes an exposure. Now what I do is I've assigned the focusing function to the AF on button on the back of the camera. So I focus first, and that because I want to choose where I'm going to focus for each photo. I mean, it's normally a third of the way in as a general rule, but sometimes I want to move it somewhere else. And it's easy to do that beforehand. So what I do is I use the AF on button to focus. I'll move the white square to where I want it. I focus, and when I'm happy with everything, I press the shutter release, wait 10 seconds, and it takes the photos, which I'll get onto. AF one shot, I mean, it's just taking one shot after another after another. That was number 7, sorry. Number 8, auto exposure bracketing on. Controversial. I use HDR on my architectural, construction and real estate photography and I'm not afraid of admitting it. What does this mean? Well, every time I take a photo, the camera takes 3 photos, one after the other, in the same operation. The first one, the correct exposure. The second one, 2 stops underexposed, as in darker. And the third one, 2 stops overexposed. Why do I do this? Because the camera cannot capture the whole range of light that our eyes can see in one image. If it could, then I wouldn't need to do this. So what I have to do is use the camera and this little bit of magic to get more of the highlights and more of the darks, and then I just chuck it all together very quickly in Lightroom. Now if you're thinking HDR and all that grungy stuff, forget it. It's just making the best use of the technology. There's nothing wrong with it. If people tell you there is something wrong with using that, then send them my way and I'll tell them that they are wrong, because this works for me. And you've got to bear in mind that on a real estate shoot, on an architectural shoot, and especially on a construction site, you do not have time to fiddle around playing with your camera settings. And that's the whole point of this, really. You've got to get in there, take the photos, get out. What I concentrate on is the composition, not the camera settings. So these are all set up before I start to shoot. So the only things I'm going to change are the aperture, not often, and the focus point, which I'll probably have a look at for every shot, change it when I need to. Apart from that, everything else is set. There's no faffing with anything. So that's the important point, which probably should have been at the beginning or the end, but it's come out in the middle, so hey ho, it's fine. Number 9, drive mode, continuous shooting. That's how I get the 3 photos taken with the bracketing. 10, image recording quality, RAW. I take photos in RAW. RAW means that there is no processing applied to the photos in camera. If you shoot in JPEG, there is processing applied by the camera at the time you take the photo. You can't undo it. Sure, you can work on it, but you can't undo what the camera has done. Now, I don't want to do that. I want to do it all myself. Number 11, pitchforks at the ready, people. Auto white balance. I don't faff around with cloudy, shady, what have you, tungsten, fluorescent. I use auto white balance and I change it later in Lightroom because I'm shooting in RAW. All the white balance presets are there for me, so I don't need to faff around. Again, I haven't got time to muck around on site, so that's what I do. 12, metering. I use evaluative metering, which is the default, which is covering pretty much that much of your viewfinder. It's just ignoring the bits around the edges and concentrating on the main focus, which if you think about it, when you're photographing a building, makes perfect sense to use that, so no reason to change really. Number 13, lens focal length. That's a setting, isn't it? Of course it is. 17mm. Now my go-to lens, which is a great Canon L series lens, L series being professional, high quality, weather sealed, Canon 17-40 lens, and I use it 95% of the time at 17mm. In fact, on interior shoots, on an exterior shoot, I might zoom in a little bit just to save cropping later because I don't like cropping. I like to get the composition as it is and not change it later. So on an interior, on the interiors, I sometimes stick a bit of gaffer's tape on the lens to make sure it stays at 17mm. So all the images look the same, the focal length's the same, and it works for me. So 17mm. 14, autofocus on. Now, why would you not use autofocus? I can't think of a single reason why. Again, I'm sure people will shoot me down for that, but I can't remember when I last used manual focus, so it's more about taking the photos, isn't it? 15, camera mounted on a tripod. Yes, I take 95% of the photos. Well, I take every photo I can on a tripod. The only times I don't are if there isn't room, or I need to put my camera physically on the floor, on a shelf, on a scaffold, or on a 4-meter painter's pole. Yes, I do use a painter's pole. Right, that's it. I've spoken far too much. I hope you found this video informative. Next week, there will be another video in my series on becoming a real estate photographer. That's all for now. Check out my website, rickmcavoyphotography.com. check out my podcast, Photography Explained Podcast. And with that, I will say cheers from me, Rick.